It's late, the kind of late where the air feels heavier. Somewhere far off, a ship creaks softly in its moorings. You can almost hear footsteps echoing down a hallway lined with brass lanterns. Someone delivering a telegram, or maybe just walking back to their cabin. The kind of quiet that comes just before everything changes, but hasn't yet. And you're here. I'm glad. This quiet corner of history isn't for everyone, but if you've found your way to it, maybe it's exactly where you're meant to be. Before we sink any deeper, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe, only if the silence suits you. And if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something gentle in knowing we're all scattered across the map, but drifting in the same story. So, pull the blanket close. Let the light go low. Maybe open the window, just a little. Let the night in, but only the soft parts. The cold can wait. The world can wait. You've made it this far, and now we rest together. The mornings in Belfast were slow to warm. Even in spring the mist hung low, curling around rooftops, drifting between chimney stacks. Down by the docks the smoke rose earlier than the sun. At Harland Wolf the day began with footsteps, dozens, then hundreds, boots striking stone, worn soles brushing frost. Men arrived one by one, collars turned up, hands buried deep in their coat pockets. Nobody spoke much. There wasn't time. The shift horn hadn't sounded yet, but it would, and when it did, silence would give way to thunder. You wouldn't have seen Titanic yet. Not really, just the skeleton. Ribs of steel arching upward, taller than buildings. A metal forest of scaffolding and ladders and cranes that swayed slightly in the wind. She didn't look like a ship, not yet, just a shadow of something bigger. The men called it the yard, but it wasn't a yard the way we imagine. It was a world unto itself, grey stone buildings, stacks of timber, black pools of water and coal piled like hills. The air tasted of oil and iron. There was always dust and always the clang, 1,000 hammers finding rhythm. Inside the sheds there were shipwrights with chalk behind their ears, riveters with scorched gloves, boys barely 16 running messages from one end of the slipway to the other. The older men moved slower but with precision. They knew every bolt, every girder, every spark before it flew. And then there were the sounds. The hammering was not random, it came in beats. 4 men to a rivet gang. One held the red-hot rivet with tongs. One pressed a heavy iron bar behind it, and 2 struck in turns, driving the metal home. Over and over, steel meeting steel. The sound didn't stop, not even during lunch. Meals were short and quiet. Bread wrapped in cloth, bits of cheese or cold meat, sometimes an apple if someone could spare it, tea if they were lucky. Men sat wherever. There was space, on crates, against girders, beside barrels. Hands black with soot, knuckles scraped raw, jaws moving slow. They didn't complain, not out loud. This was good work, steady, hard, but good. And Titanic was no ordinary ship. They knew that. Everyone in Belfast did. Mothers talked about it at markets. Children pointed toward the harbour when smoke rose higher than usual. There was pride in the making. What they were building was more than steel. It was elegance, grandeur, though none of them would ever sail aboard her. The days passed like clockwork. Sparks lit the shadows. Cranes groaned overhead. Sometimes it rained, but the work never paused. Fabricators tightened bolts with hands that could no longer feel cold. Electricians ran wires behind walls that would soon be panelled in mahogany. Painters brushed layers of lead white onto hull plates, their strokes long and even like they were putting the sea to sleep. The supervisors walked slowly, with ledgers tucked beneath their arms. They checked measurements, whispered corrections, but mostly they just watched, because in truth, nothing moved without the hands of the men. The yard ran on muscle and rhythm. It breathed through labour. Each day was like the one before and the one that would follow. There was comfort in the sameness, in the way time folded gently between tea breaks and tool checks, and still Titanic grew. From below, she seemed too big to ever move. Her sides rose like walls. Her propellers, when they finally arrived, stood taller than any man. Men craned their necks to look up, and for a moment the work stopped. Just a moment, just long enough to remember what they were part of. By evening the light turned orange and then grey. The clanging softened. The yard emptied slowly, boots again on stone, this time going the other way. Some went home, some to the pub, some walked alone with Sue, tea still on their faces, and in the quiet that followed, Titanic stayed behind. She did not speak, but she waited, massive and still, half-born and dreaming. This is how a ship was made. Not in one night, not with ceremony, but with hands that never hurried, and days that all felt the same. And in that sameness, something magnificent began to take shape. The hammering had stopped. Not forever, just for now. After months of noise, the yard grew quiet. The final pieces had been placed, the last rail polished, the final light fitted into its brass mount. Titanic no longer looked like a project. She looked like something ready. But still, she waited. Inside, the ship was quiet in a way that only new places can be. The kind of quiet that exists before anyone has walked the halls in their best shoes. Before doors have been knocked on, before laughter or music or voices. A stillness that feels like breath being held. The corridors stretched long and clean, lined with white painted wood, polished handrails, and soft brass fittings. The carpets had just been laid, dark red and green patterns with a thick, muffled feel beneath each step. Most people never noticed the soundproofing, but it was there. Layers of cork beneath the flooring, soft wall coverings, hidden padding between cabins. This ship had been designed to be quiet. The grand staircase, the one everyone knows, sat waiting too. Its carved oak glowed warmly in the dim lamplight. At the top, a small clock ticked softly. Not for the guests, not yet, but for the stewards and cleaners, the ones who moved silently through the rooms, checking details one last time. One of them, a young woman in a neat uniform, adjusted a vase in a first-class lounge, just slightly. The flowers were fresh. They had been changed that morning. The water was still cold. She didn't speak. No one around her did. The job was about quiet hands and careful movements, creases to be smoothed, curtains to be straightened. The scent of varnish still hung in the air. Not strong, just a hint, like something tucked into the corners of the room. It blended with the faint smell of new fabric, beeswax polish, and leather-bound menus that hadn't yet been touched. Staterooms were being prepared one by one. Sheets drawn tight, towels folded square, small soaps placed carefully beside the wash basins. The mirrors were clean, framed in dark wood. Most would never fog, not with Titanic's ventilation system, but the staff wiped them anyway. The lamps glowed low. Not all were lit, just enough to guide the workers from one room to the next, just enough to keep shadows soft. Farther down, past the music room and smoking lounge, there were reading rooms, card tables, writing desks with unused stationery, still perfectly stacked, ink bottles unopened, pens untouched. On another deck, a steward knelt beside a brass fixture, turning it gently to check for leaks. None. The plumbing had been tested 3 times already, but he checked again. Routine was comfort, especially when no one was watching. The Turkish bath sat completely still, tiles warm underfoot. The air inside held the faintest trace of lavender oil. The towels were rolled tight, stacked in even rows. Nobody had splashed water here yet. Nobody had rested against the cool stone benches, breathing in the steam. But they would, soon. And above all of this, above the wood and brass and velvet, were the decks, wide, pale, clean. The chairs had been arranged in neat rows. Folded blankets sat across some of them, soft and unused. The sea stretched beyond, silent and dark blue. The sky was overcast that day, but still bright. Seagulls circled far off, calling to no one. Deckhands moved along slowly, checking ropes and railings. They wore dark uniforms and wool caps, and they walked without rush. This was the final stretch. Just inspections now, just soft adjustments. A man with a brass key opened a small closet near the stern. Inside were deck games, quoits, beanbags, skittles, all packed tightly in fresh canvas. None had been used, none had been touched by passengers. They still smelled of sawdust and string. Below, the kitchens were still, utensils lined up, pots hanging quietly, ovens unused. Cooks would arrive tomorrow, and with them the noise, the orders, the clatter, the low songs sung out of habit. But tonight only the cooling metal remembered what heat felt like. And somewhere near the wireless room, a young operator sat flipping through a logbook. His fingers moved without sound, reading a list of codes and frequencies. The Marconi set was quiet. He didn't test it yet. He just waited. Because all of this, every surface, every fixture, every hallway and hinge, was waiting. The Titanic wasn't alive yet. Not really. Not until people came aboard. Not until names were on doors and bags placed on beds. But even in the silence, you could feel it, something ready to begin. And for now, the silence was enough. Not everyone on Titanic walked polished decks or slept on feather beds. Some lived below the waterline, deep inside the ship, where sunlight never reached. They didn't wear uniforms trimmed in gold. Their collars were low, their boots scuffed, their hands dark with coal. These were the men who kept the ship alive, and most passengers would never even know their names. The engine rooms were vast, almost like cathedrals made of iron. Pipes ran overhead like ribs. Valves lined the walls. Gauges ticked steadily, blinking in the dim light like quiet eyes. The air was thick, warm even when the ship was cold, and everywhere the steady thrum of motion. The firemen were the heartbeat. They fed the furnaces day and night, shoveling coal from massive piles into open mouths of fire. Each furnace burned hot, white-orange at its centre, and needed constant feeding. A fireman's shift was 4 hours on, 4 hours off, and there were no shortcuts, no breaks. Their clothes were simple, thin undershirts soaked through with sweat, wool trousers rolled at the ankles, bandanas tied over mouths to keep out the dust, but the dust still came. Black smears on the face, under the nails, behind the ears. Beside them were the trimmers. Their job was to manage the coal, not just feed it, but balance it. Coal was stored in bunkers along the side of the ship, and if too much weight gathered in one area, the ship could list slightly. So the trimmers moved it, wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, shovel by shovel, quietly, carefully, and constantly. Then there were the greasers. Their job was quieter, but no less important. They carried small oiling cans and cloths, checking the giant pistons, turbines, and moving rods for signs of wear. Titanic's engines were massive, stories tall, and they moved with slow, steady force. The greasers kept them smooth. A squeak meant trouble. A dry gear could mean failure. So they walked in loops, day and night, checking every joint, every moving part, wiping down metal that never cooled. These men didn't eat in fine dining rooms. Their meals were in the crew mess, simple, plain, and hot. Boiled potatoes, tea, thick bread, sometimes stew. They sat on wooden benches, eating quickly, speaking only when necessary. Most of the time they were too tired for conversation. Their sleeping quarters were narrow and low. Small bunks stacked 3 high, 1 blanket, 1 pillow. No windows, no breeze, just the sound of the ship, always humming, always moving. Some of the men carried photographs, tucked inside shirt pockets or taped above their beds. Wives, children, small cottages in the countryside, but few spoke of home. The work was here, now, and there was no room for dreaming during a shift. There was routine in everything. Wake up, eat, work, eat again, sleep. Wash up in lukewarm water if time allowed, hang shirts to dry on hooks. Then back to the heat, the coal, the metal. And yet, despite the soot and silence, there was pride. Titanic was the most powerful ship in the world, and these men, these firemen, greasers and trimmers, were the ones who made her move. Every mile of ocean crossed began with a shovel scraping into coal, a boot stepping onto steel. No one applauded, no one visited the engine rooms to say thank you. But the ship moved because they moved, and if they stopped, even for a moment, everything above would go still. At night, while the passengers dressed for dinner and listened to string quartets, the men below drank tea in tin cups and wiped sweat from their brows. Their music was the clink of tools, the hum of machinery, the distant echo of steam releasing pressure. They were the invisible crew, the ones who worked in heat and shadow, deep below the chandeliers and crystal glasses. And they asked for nothing more than a steady shift, a warm meal and dry socks. Down there was no ocean view, just the walls of the ship. But still, they knew the sea was out there, pressing quietly against the hull, waiting, and Titanic, for all her beauty, for all her size, could only move because of them. He stood straighter than most men twice his age. Shoulders back, chin up, cap level, jacket brushed. He was just 15, maybe a few months shy of it, but he walked the corridors of Titanic with the quiet purpose of someone older. He was a bellboy, one of many, but not one easily noticed. That was the point. Bellboys were trained to be nearly invisible, fast, polite, precise. They didn't make noise, they didn't linger, they didn't forget. And yet every day they carried more details than most passengers would ever see. His uniform was always pressed, a short navy jacket with brass buttons, matching trousers, and a small stiff cap worn low over his messy brown hair. No pockets on the jacket, just one on the side of his trousers, just enough room for the folded schedule he kept on him at all times. That paper, worn and creased, filled with tiny handwriting, room numbers, luggage instructions, wake-up calls, names scribbled with care. He checked it often, usually with one hand while walking, eyes trained to stay forward, legs already moving to his next task. His shift began early. The bellboys were up before most passengers. The older stewards would wake them with a gentle knock, 2 soft taps on the wooden bunk frame, and then a whispered reminder: uniforms, breakfast, stand ready. He shared a small bunk room with 6 others. Cramped, quiet, laughter only whispered when the lights were off. They all understood that noise travelled on Titanic, especially in first class. Silence was part of the job. Breakfast was plain: tea, bread, sometimes porridge. They ate fast, cleaned up their own plates, and reported to their post, standing neatly in the corridors outside stateroom doors. Hands folded, shoes polished, expression neutral. Sometimes a steward would check their posture. Sometimes they'd practice their knock, not too loud, not too soft, just enough to be eared behind a thick panelled door. 3 knocks, a pause, then, "Bellboy, sir, may I assist?" Most passengers were kind. Some ignored him. A few were sharp with their words, but he never answered back. That, too, was part of the training. His day was filled with small tasks, tiny things that together kept the whole ship running smoothly. Fetching suitcases, delivering notes, carrying trays, guiding guests down long corridors, polishing door handles, adjusting pillows in the lounge, and always, always remembering names. Not just Mr. Andrews or Lady Duff Gordon, but the lesser-known ones. The quiet man in B14 who liked early tea. The woman in C62 who needed help with her shoes. The family with the little girl who always asked for marmalade. The bellboy remembered them all, or tried to. He kept a tiny pencil tucked behind his ear, the soft kind, worn down to a nub. And sometimes, when no one was watching, he'd jot down a quick note on the back of his folded schedule. Things like, Mrs. H. prefers her tea warm, not hot. Trunk to be moved to D20 before supper. Newspaper for Mr. C at 8 a.m. sharp. He didn't read the newspaper himself, but he liked the feel of it, the smooth pages, the soft crackle when folded. There was very little time to rest. Breaks were short, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes less. He'd find a quiet spot behind a stairwell or outside the smoking room, just enough space to breathe. He didn't mind the work. It kept him focused, and there was something nice about knowing exactly what came next. At night, when the guests had settled and the halls dimmed, he walked one last round. He checked on packages, picked up forgotten coats, adjusted the rug near the reception desk so no one would trip in the morning. And then, finally, back to the bunk room. His legs ached. His hands were dry. He lay on the thin mattress with the folded schedule still in his pocket. Sometimes the ship rocked gently. He didn't mind that either. It reminded him of home, though he wasn't sure why. He missed his mother's stew. He missed the sound of rain on the cottage roof. But Titanic felt like something important, something he was part of. Not a guest, not a tourist, not someone passing through. He was part of the ship, in the same way the carpets were part of the floor, or the clocks part of the wall, always present, always working, always watching. And in the quiet moments before sleep, he would press his fingers to the edge of the schedule, just to feel the paper was still there. It always was. Long before the passengers arrived, before the kitchen smelled of roast beef and bread, before a single napkin was folded into a swan, the counting began. Not of people, but of plates and bowls and cups and knives. The quiet work of preparing the Titanic wasn't only about rivets or woodwork. It was about order, about precision, about everything being just so. Each piece of china had a number, not scratched in, but marked with a tiny stamp, white star, gold border, always in the same spot. Cups were matched to saucers, plates to side plates. There were separate sets for first class, second class, and third, and within those sets, even more divisions, luncheon sets, tea service, dessert ware, soup bowls for fish courses, butter dishes, sugar basins. The stewards didn't just unpack crates, they inspected them. Each box had a manifest, a handwritten list of what should be inside. 54 teacups, 54 saucers, one missing. The entire box was checked again. No guessing, no almost. And when everything was confirmed, it was logged. A clean ledger, its columns filled in ink. Blue-black, steady handwriting. One steward did the writing, another called the numbers, a third double-checked. They did it all quietly. No music, no chatter. Only the soft sounds of china being unwrapped from tissue, one careful hand at a time. There were over 57,000 pieces of tableware aboard the Titanic, and every single one had its place. Napkins, too, starched and folded, then stacked by size. First-class napkins were the largest, folded into fan shapes for dinner and pyramid shapes for lunch. Each was ironed by hand, pressed flat, and counted in stacks of 20. Linen cloths were logged separately. Dining room, cafe, pantry use only. The silver was polished twice, not because it was dirty, but because it might have been, first with a cloth soaked in chalk paste, then with a dry, soft rag. Forks, spoons, knives, tongs, fish servers and sugar shells. Each piece gleamed by the end, and no fingerprints remained. Glassware had its own system. Wine glasses were taller, water glasses were shorter. The crystal used in first class had a ring to it, a soft bell sound when tapped. Staff learned to listen for that sound. A chipped glass didn't ring. Those were pulled aside without comment. In the still spaces behind the dining rooms, the pantries were arranged with perfect care. White shelves, labelled in chalk, stacks of dishes resting like puzzle pieces. Space left between sets so nothing would shift when the ship moved. The smell back there was faint, a little like soap, a little like dry paper, and something else. Maybe linen, maybe dust. Each item had a routine. After every meal, dishes were washed, then sorted, then checked again. Not just for cleanliness, but for count. Nothing was ever assumed, nothing taken for granted. Stewards stood beside long wooden tables with tall stacks at their elbows. They worked quickly but gently, trained not to clink. Plates weren't slid. They were lifted, placed, balanced. Behind them, someone else wrote the numbers down, again. There were ledgers for everything. Notebooks filled with small writing, times, dates, item counts, initials. A napkin went missing. It was logged. A butter knife cracked, logged. If 3 spoons were delivered instead of 4, a note was made, and the 4th would be traced back to its tray. This wasn't obsession, it was care. Perfection wasn't a luxury aboard Titanic, it was policy. Passengers saw beauty, polished tables, crisp linens, sparkling glasses. But behind the doors, out of view, it was the quiet hands that made it all happen. Even the menus had rules. They were printed fresh each day. The fonts were selected carefully. The spacing had to be exact. One smudge, and it was done again. Each menu was slipped into a holder on the table, aligned perfectly between 2 candlesticks. And when the dining rooms were finally set, the head steward would walk slowly from end to end. He checked the tables, not for grandness, but for balance. He would gently shift a fork, turn a knife by 1/2 inch, straighten a place card, not out of pride, out of habit. He'd been trained too, just like the bellboys, just like the china counters, just like everyone who worked aboard this ship that hadn't yet sailed. The Titanic was often called the most luxurious ship ever built. But what most people didn't see was this: the thousands of tiny movements, the quiet repetitions, the counting, done again and again, until every plate, every spoon, every folded corner felt like it had always belonged. It's easy to think of ice as the ending, but for Titanic, ice was part of the beginning. Before there was a voyage, before there was even a final coat of paint, plans had already been drawn for ice rooms, cold pantries, and cooling coils hidden deep within the walls. Luxury needed cold. Cold for butter, cold for oysters, cold for wine, fruit, meat and cream. So the ship was built with chill in mind. Titanic carried over 80 tons of ice, not floating outside, but stored inside, in square blocks, stacked tight and sweating in the dark. The ice came aboard in Belfast, lifted gently down steel ramps and into compartments lined with thick cork insulation. Some of it would never be touched. It would simply sit, cooling its quiet space, slowly melting, then draining into narrow pipes that led to the sea. There were whole rooms just for cold. Large storage chambers where the temperature stayed steady even when the ship swayed. Meat was hung from hooks. Fish was packed in crushed ice. Baskets of fruit sat on wooden shelves, oranges, pears, grapes, still wrapped in tissue. Milk stood in rows beside them, capped in wax, cool to the touch. The air inside these rooms was dry and still. Frost gathered near the door hinges. Metal glinted faintly in the low light, and the scent was sharp but clean, a mix of salt, wood, and citrus. The men who worked here wore heavier coats. Wool gloves, flat caps pulled low. They moved slowly, not because they were cold, but because breakage was costly. One cracked bottle, one dropped crate, and everything near it had to be checked again. There were rules, of course. How to open the door without warming the space. how to rotate the food so nothing sat too long, how to log every item taken and everyone returned. Some of the ice wasn't for storage at all. It was for elegance. First-class guests expected cold drinks, not lukewarm ones, so cubes were air-chipped and shaped by hand. There was an iceman assigned to each galley. His job was simple: keep things cold quietly. He worked behind the scenes in rooms with low ceilings, his hands wet most of the day. He used a wooden mallet and a long pick. Tap, split, shape, repeat. The ice blocks were dense and clear, thick as bricks and cold enough to sting the fingers. From these he made perfect cubes. Sometimes small pyramids, sometimes delicate curls of frost for champagne buckets. He never spoke while working. There was no need, just the tapping, just the trickle of meltwater down the sides of the block, running into a narrow drain carved into the floor. Above all this, far above, near the passengers, were the pantries. They had smaller ice boxes tucked beneath counters, metal-lined compartments filled each morning with fresh chips of ice. Stewards would lift the lids, check the temperature with their hands, and make notes in a slim notebook. The ice was replaced before lunch, again before dinner. Always quiet, always careful. Even the flowers aboard Titanic had their own cold rooms. Fresh-cut roses, lilies, and daffodils were stored upright in long trays. These flowers were used for table settings, guest cabins, and reception areas. And they needed cold. Not too much, but just enough to keep their stems crisp. The air in the flower room smelled green and clean, a faint trace of earth, even out at sea. Someone had trimmed their ends just that morning. A thin pile of stems still lay beside the sink, and beyond the flowers, beyond the drinks and butter and beef, there were ice cream moulds, neatly stacked near the back of the kitchen, shaped like pineapples, roses, or fans. These were for the grand dinners, the ones with 6 courses, soft music, and silver service. The moulds were filled and frozen, then brought out at the perfect moment. They glistened in the candlelight, held high by white-gloved hands, melting slowly by the time they reached the table. No one thought of the men below who had packed the ice. No one thought of the cork-lined walls or the quiet dripping from metal trays. They only saw the beauty. But that beauty was built on cold, and cold had to be managed. Every day, every shift in silence. Even when Titanic rested in port, the cold rooms stayed humming. The ice rooms stayed dark and full, and a single man walked the halls with a lantern, checking the temperatures, running his hand along the frost-lined pipes, listening for any sound that didn't belong. Ice wasn't an accident. It was planned, stored, measured, carried not to hurt, but to preserve. And long before the iceberg, Titanic had already mastered the cold. The ship had settled, not stopped. No, Titanic never stopped, but settled. The footsteps had faded. The dining rooms were quiet. The decks nearly empty. It was late, midnight, maybe a little past, the kind of hour where even clocks seemed to tick softer. And out on the open deck, up near the railings, under the stars, the world had gone still. The chairs were still out. Deck chairs made of wood and cane, arranged in loose rows, some with blankets folded neatly across the arms. A few were occupied. Lone figures wrapped in coats, hands tucked inside sleeves, heads tilted slightly toward the sea. The air was cold, but not biting. It carried the faintest trace of salt, not sharp, but soft, like wet linen or stone warmed earlier by sun. And ahead, only ocean. Not waves, not crashing surf, just long, flat swells, slow and deep, as if the water were breathing. Each rise and fall was gentle. The sea wasn't in a hurry tonight. From where you sat, the railings gleamed faintly. brass polished smooth, catching what little light the moon gave. Above, canvas stretched tight along the promenade roof. It creaked slightly, not unpleasantly, just the sound of rope pulled taut by movement. Somewhere far off, a piano was still playing. Just a few soft notes drifting up from a saloon window left ajar. The kind of melody that didn't need attention. It wandered gently. Something classical, maybe, or something improvised, played more for the night than for any person listening. If you looked up, the stars were clearer than they ever were on land. The sky wasn't black, but a deep blue, endless, hushed. No clouds, just stars, scattered thick across the sky, reflected faintly in the water below. Sometimes the ship creaked, not loudly, just enough to remind you it was there. A low groan of wood somewhere behind the wall, a soft rattle of glass in a nearby door. She was still moving, still slicing the sea in complete quiet. And yet, she felt still. A steward passed once. You heard his shoes before you saw him, soft rubber soles across the planks. He adjusted a blanket draped over a chair, picked up an empty glass someone had left behind. No words. No glance. He moved with the slow rhythm of someone who knew this hour well. You shifted slightly. The deck chair creaked under your weight. A slow, hollow sound that faded as you settled again. Your breath left in small clouds, visible for just a second, then gone. Somewhere far below, the engines murmured, not loudly, not forcefully. Just a low vibration that travelled through the soles of your shoes, up through the wood of the chair, into your bones, like a cat purring, or a deep, distant hum. Comforting, predictable, constant. The night stretched. Nothing asked anything of you here. No announcements, no noise. No rush, only time, slow and unshaped, passing over the sea. Your eyes moved across the horizon. There was nothing there. No lights, no land. Just darkness, pure and open. And still, it didn't feel lonely. It felt vast, safe somehow, as though the ship carried its own little world. A floating island of warmth and wood and music, drifting softly through a sleeping sea. You listened, not to hear something new, but to stay within what was already there. The piano had stopped now, replaced by the soft hiss of wind between railings, a gentle creak of chain from a lifeboat above, the brush of your sleeve as you folded your arms. The ship moved on. Not faster, not slower, just steady, forward, always forward. Someone nearby stood up. You heard the quiet rustle of a coat, the shuffle of shoes, then silence again. The chair beside you rocked slightly before coming to rest, and you remained, wrapped in the cold, wrapped in the dark, wrapped in a ship that felt, at least for this moment, untouchable. The ocean didn't speak. It simply was. And the ship, its lanterns glowing soft, its flag stilled in the wind, continued through the water like a dream no one wanted to wake from. They were there from the beginning, hanging neatly along the upper decks, painted in cream and buff, ropes coiled, oars tucked inside, canvas covers stretched smooth, lifeboats. But nobody paid much attention to them. Passengers passed them on walks, pausing more for the view than for the boats themselves. Some used them as landmarks. Turn left after the fourth lifeboat and you'll find the reading room. Children sometimes peeked inside. A few reached out to tap the side, just to hear the sound of hollow wood, but mostly they were ignored. Even the crew had grown used to their presence. There were 20 boats in total. 4 collapsibles, barely noticed. 14 wooden ones, more obvious, but still, somehow, background. They weren't meant for comfort. No brass, no cushions, just benches and slats and ropes that creaked gently when the ship moved. Each boat had a number stenciled on the side. Each was measured, weighed, registered. Every oar counted. Every coil of rope measured twice. But lifeboats weren't considered useful. Not in the modern age. Not on a ship like this. Titanic was new, strong, watertight. She had 16 compartments, separated by bulkheads and steel doors that could be closed with the push of a button. The idea of needing a lifeboat, really needing one, felt outdated. And so they sat, unbothered, unused. There had been a drill, technically. One drill, held early in the voyage. A quiet, simple thing, just enough to tick a box. A few crewmen gathered on the boat deck. 2 lifeboats were lowered slowly, while an officer watched. The ropes creaked, the pulleys worked, everything moved as it should. Then the boats were raised again and covered. Most passengers didn't see it, and those who did barely glanced. Just another part of the ship being tested, nothing to worry about. Even among the crew, lifeboat duty wasn't spoken of much. Assignments were written on small slips of paper posted in common areas near the mess beside the bunks, but few read them carefully. Shifts were busy, schedules were full. And anyway, the real work was above. In the saloons, the kitchens, the engine rooms, lifeboats. They were for insurance forms, for inspections, for show. Some officers muttered that there weren't enough of them. They weren't wrong. Even fully loaded, the boats could only carry about half of the people on board. But regulations didn't require more. Not in 1912. Not for a ship this large. Besides, the thinking was simple. The lifeboats would only be needed to ferry people to rescue ships. Not to hold everyone. Not all at once. So the boats stayed in place. Swung out just slightly, but never far. Their canvas covers were checked by deckhands every morning, wiped clean of salt, adjusted when the wind pulled them loose. The davits, the metal arms holding the boats, were oiled weekly, smooth, silent, ready. But readiness didn't mean awareness. No one explained how to board them. No signs pointed to their location. There were no public drills, no rehearsals. Just the quiet presence of wood and rope, gently swaying when the ship moved through waves. At night they cast shadows onto the deck, long shapes stretching across the planks as lanterns flickered overhead. Passengers walked beside them on moonlit strolls, their shoes tapping softly along the boards. Some leaned against the rails just behind the boats, looking out at the Black Sea beyond. They talked about music and letters and where they were going. Nobody mentioned the boats, and in truth, they weren't built to inspire confidence. They were practical, plain, lined with metal water cans, small canvas sails, emergency rations sealed in tins. No one ever asked to see what was inside. Tea. Hay weren't beautiful. They weren't grand. They were just there. And yet they were part of the ship, as much as the railings, the flags, the lights. By day they sat in the sun. By night they watched the stars. But even as Titanic moved steadily west, across a sea that stretched colder each evening, the lifeboats remained untouched. Not because people didn't care, but because they didn't think they'd need to, and so they waited. Wooden things people walked past. Far below the glittering dining rooms and panelled lounges, another world existed. It was smaller, louder, and full of quiet hope. Third class, steerage, as some still called it. But to those who lived there it was simply a beginning. The cabins were plain, painted white with low ceilings and narrow bunks stacked 2 or 3 high. Mattresses were filled with straw, pillows thin. The sheets were clean, but nothing more. No frills, no lace. Some cabins held entire families. Others were shared by strangers, 4 men who had just met, or 2 sisters from a village far from the sea. The air inside was warm, close, sometimes filled with the scent of wool coats and travel dust. There were no windows, only the faint hum of the ship and the soft creak of metal pipes that ran overhead. Outside the cabins were long corridors, always busy, always full of motion. Children played between the luggage. Mothers whispered lullabies behind closed doors. Voices rose in many languages, Irish, Swedish, Italian, Polish, overlapping softly like waves. The bathrooms were shared. A handful for hundreds of people. Simple wash basins, cold water only, a mirror nailed to the wall. There were lines in the morning, quiet ones. People waiting with towels over their arms, still half asleep, shoes unlaced. Meals were served in a large dining hall, deep in the belly of the ship. The tables were wooden, the benches long, no candles, no white cloths, but always a warm plate. Breakfast was usually porridge or bread, sometimes a bit of ham. Lunch brought stew, thick with potatoes and onions. Supper, more bread, maybe tea, maybe jam. No one complained, because the food was steady and hot, and there was enough. Most had come aboard with little more than a trunk. Some carried letters, some family photographs, a scarf from home, a worn book, a tin of sweets wrapped in cloth, each item tucked in tie, but folded with care, not because of what it cost, but because of what it meant. There were farmers, miners, cooks, seamstresses, young men in borrowed suits, mothers holding babies wrapped in shawls, and girls with new shoes, not yet scuffed, travelling farther than they ever had before. They didn't walk the upper decks. That space wasn't meant for them, but they had their own open-air space near the stern, a section with benches and railings and salt in the air. There they leaned out over the water, pointing at the horizon, watching the smoke trail curl behind them like a ribbon. There was music too, even here. Not a string quartet, but fiddles and clapping hands. On some evenings, someone would sing, a soft voice carrying an old tune from a country left behind. Others would tap their feet or hum along. The children danced, laughing, spinning in small circles beneath low lamplight. And always there were stories, told in quiet corners, whispered between bunk beds, or passed in the hallway with a nod. Stories about where they were going, what they'd do, who they'd become. Some dreamed of land, a small farm, a garden, a place where chickens walked freely and the sky didn't end at chimney smoke. Others dreamed of work, a factory job, steady wages, something that let them send money back home. A few dreamed of love, of meeting someone new, starting fresh, raising children who spoke a different language, with shoes made for city streets instead of fields. And though the rooms were crowded, though the air was never still, there was a kind of warmth below deck that couldn't be measured in elegance. Because for these passengers this ship was more than a journey, it was a door, a way from old to new, from hard winters to softer mornings, from struggle to something almost like peace. They didn't need chandeliers or servants, they needed chances. And Titanic, with all her size and sound, had given them that. And so they held their children close, smoothed out blankets, tied their boots with steady fingers, and waited for morning, waited for land, waited for what came next. The band played soft music in the first-class lounge, a piano, a violin, something easy on the ears. A waltz slowed down to lullaby pace. A few couples danced. Most just listened, and above it all the stars came out. No clouds now, just cold air and sky. The ship's lights glowed yellow against the dark, warm squares in rows, flickering gently as the sea moved beneath. The wind was soft, the decks nearly empty, just the occasional pair of footsteps, a low voice, the sound of a chair being tucked back under a table. The officers took their rounds, checking railings, glancing at charts, logging the weather. Everything was normal, everything was routine. Even the cold felt ordinary, not sharp, just present. Passengers stepped back inside, pulling coats tighter, rubbing their hands for warmth. Cabin doors opened and closed, lights were dimmed, curtains drawn. Some read quietly in bed, some jotted in journals, some kissed sleeping children on the forehead. There was no hurry, no rush to finish conversations, no sense that anything would change. Tomorrow would be breakfast, a stroll on deck, more sea, more sky. Another letter sent, another meal enjoyed. Even now Titanic moved forward, steady, silent, sure. Her engines worked, her lights shone, her people dreamed, not of survival, not of disaster, just of life. New jobs, new countries, new mornings. This was the last night, but no one knew, and so they slept, tucked under wool blankets, surrounded by the hum of a ship still breathing, out at sea, out of sight, still whole. Evening came slowly. The sun dipped behind the clouds without any fuss, leaving behind a sky brushed with pale blue and silver grey. Out on deck, the air cooled just enough for coats, not freezing, just crisp. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, smooth and still, like ink spilled across glass. Inside, the ship pulsed with soft energy. Not noisy, not quiet, just alive, with the small sounds of people finishing another day. In the first-class dining saloon, light pooled beneath golden fixtures. The tables were dressed, as always, white linen, silver knives, plates set in perfect circles. The hum of voices filled the room, soft laughter, the clink of cutlery, footsteps gliding between chairs. Menus offered duck, asparagus, custard pudding. Wine glasses were filled halfway, napkins folded on laps. A few passengers leaned in close, whispering about business or books or weather back home. Further aft, second-class passengers gathered at their own tables, simpler meals, but no less satisfying. Roast beef, fresh bread, a helping of jam. Children asked for seconds. Older couples sat hand in hand. Everyone had their own corner, their own rhythm, their own idea of what tomorrow would bring. In third class, the dining room echoed with more life. Chairs scraping, boots tapping, voices layered in dozens of accents. The food was plain, soup, boiled potatoes, cold meats, but it was warm and it was shared. Some talked, some ate in silence, some laughed with strangers who had become friends somewhere between Queenstown and mid-ocean. And all across the ship, outside the kitchens and cabins, crew members moved quietly. In the linen rooms, hands folded napkins with practiced ease. Stacks of fresh towels were placed near the baths. A steward straightened pillows on a lounge chair no one had used that evening. Below deck, in the engine rooms, the great machinery still breathed. The air was hot and thick. Men wiped their foreheads with cloths gone grey from use. Valves hissed softly. Pressure held steady. A stoker shovelled coal into the firebox, not in a hurry, not tired, just focused. He'd done this 100 times. He would do it 100 more. In the mailroom, leather bags were weighed and tagged, letters sorted into canvas bins, ink-stamped, bundled, shelved. Up in the wireless room, sparks flickered softly from the transmitter, messages tapped out across the air, dinner invitations, news from shore, jokes shared between ships. The operator leaned back in his chair between signals, rubbing his eyes, sipping lukewarm tea. Elsewhere, uniforms were brushed and hung, shoes polished to a dull glow. A bellboy folded his notes and slid them beneath his pillow, already memorized. His bunkmate whispered something, a joke maybe. and both boys chuckled quietly before sleep.